Welcome to this deep dive into a pretty fascinating chapter of history. We're going to be looking at some excerpts from The Bitter Cup, true stories of race relations in the early church.
Okay.
Now, most people, I think, associate Joseph Smith, with just religious history, but get ready to see him in a whole new light as an early advocate for racial justice.
Oh, wow.
Decades before the Civil War. It's pretty remarkable.
Okay.
1830s America.
Okay.
Imagine a nation deeply divided over slavery,
Right.
where racial tensions are incredibly high.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting here is that slavery wasn't just some abstract moral debate.
No.
It was woven into the very fabric of the economy.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point.
Yeah.
I mean, the Southern economy relied heavily on slave labor for, things like cotton.
Right.
And then that cotton-fueled textile mills up north, even across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a massive global system
Yeah.
with huge economic implications.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Challenging slavery meant challenging the entire flow of goods.
Right.
And the power held by those who profited from it.
It's easy to kind of forget how interconnected everything was back then.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay, so against this backdrop,
Okay.
we have Joseph Smith, who's leading this new religious movement.
Right.
And the source details a pretty chilling incident that really, I think, highlights the intensity of these racial dynamics.
Okay.
It involves a brutal attack on Smith and one of his close associates, Sidney Rigdon.
And it wasn't just any attack. This mob was made up of members of this rival religious group called the Campbellites.
Hold on. Can we just pause there for a
Okay,
second?
sure, sir.
Those might not be familiar.
Okay.
Who are the Campbellites?
Sure. So both the Campbellites and Smith's followers were part of this larger religious wave known as the Second Great Awakening.
Right.
But they had some pretty significant disagreements.
Yeah.
Mainly about things like baptism and how the church should be organized.
Okay.
And these theological differences often played out in very public debates.
Wow. So, theological debates could actually turn violent back then.
Oh, absolutely.
Huh.
Religious fervor was a powerful force.
Yeah.
Disagreements could get very personal and dangerous.
So this mob of Campbellites
Right.
attacks Smith and Rigdon.
Yep.
And the source mentions this detail that I found just incredibly chilling.
Oh, okay.
They were wearing blackface.
Yeah, that's a crucial detail.
It wasn't just about disguising themselves.
No, it was a statement.
Right.
Blackface in that era was a tool used to intimidate and dehumanize Black people. It's a reflection of the deep-seated racial prejudice that was so prevalent at the time.
It's a stark reminder of just how intertwined racism and violence were.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it all starts on March 24th, 1832. Imagine this, right? It's the middle of the night, dead of night, and a mob. They've got their faces covered, blackened with charcoal. And they descend upon this small cabin, rural Ohio.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, what happened that night, the details are, well, they're disturbing.
Yeah, disturbing is a good word.
The Campbellites, they burst into the cabin. I mean, Smith, his wife, their two infant children, Rigdon, they're all sleeping. And they drag Smith and Rigdon outside, just start beating them brutally. And tragically, I mean, it gets worse. The violence that night, it goes beyond the beating, which is awful enough. One of Smith's infant children actually died because of the attack.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
The mob, they covered Smith's body in tar and feathers. They even tried to force acid down his throat. It's a horrifying image.
Oh, it's awful.
He managed to clench his teeth, and that saved his life. But, I mean, it left him with lasting scars, chipped tooth, and a slight lisp that he had for the rest of his life.
The brutality is it's undeniable.
But what specifically triggered this attack?
Well, it seems like Sidney Rigdon had recently converted to Smith's church.
Okay.
And he brought a large number of followers with him, including a freed Black slave named Pete.
And this is where things get really interesting,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And you have to remember, this was just a few months after Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia.
Oh, wow.
So white fear and paranoia about Black literacy
Right.
and religious practice were at an all-time high.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of states were passing laws to restrict the rights of Black people, making it almost unthinkable for a Black man to hold any position of authority,
Right.
let alone in a church.
And yet here's Joseph Smith not only welcoming Black members into his church,
Right.
but also allowing a Black man to rise within the ranks.
Yeah, it was a bold move.
You'd think after going through something like that, I mean, that kind of racially motivated violence, you'd think Joseph Smith would just back away from issues of race.
Right.
I mean, it'd be understandable, wouldn't it?
Completely understandable. I mean, given the trauma, what he went through.
But that's not what happened at all. It's like the opposite almost.
It's really, I mean, talk about a twist in the story, right? It's surprising because despite the danger, all the opposition, Smith, he keeps welcoming Black members into the Latter-day Saints Church and even takes a more radical step just a few years later. In 1836, just 4 years after that horrific attack, Smith ordains Elijah Abel to the priesthood.
Wow.
It was a bold move, a direct challenge to the racial hierarchy of the time.
Ordaining a Black man to the priesthood, that's a huge statement.
It seems to mark a real turning point,
Yeah.
His experiences, the violence he endured, the convictions he held, they all seem to converge
Right.
and push him to think more systematically about injustice.
So he's moving beyond addressing like individual instances of racism
Yes.
to tackling like the root of the problem.
Precisely. He starts to see the interconnectedness of racial injustice with the economic and political systems.
Right.
And this realization leads him to a pretty radical decision.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What does he do?
He decides to run for president of the United States in 1844.
Wow. A religious leader running for president on a platform of racial justice in the 1840s. That's certainly not what I expected.
Yeah, it was a bold move.
What were the key elements of his platform?
Well, for starters, he called for the abolition of slavery by 1850. It was radical. He wanted to abolish slavery within 6 years. 6 years.
Yeah.
And he wanted to compensate slaveholders with the government funds. I mean, on top of that, he wanted full racial equality across the board.
Can you imagine? This is 1844, almost 20 years before the Civil War, which, was fought over this very issue. Wow.
Smith made it central to his campaign.
That's incredibly bold.
Yeah.
Especially considering, the economic dependence on slavery we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Think about that for a second. This is decades before the Civil War, decades before the abolition movement even gains any traction. I mean, even people who opposed slavery back then, a lot of them, they didn't believe in full racial equality.
Right.
So for Smith to do that then, in that climate, took some serious courage. I mean, he was risking everything.
He was. And those threats, the ones we talked about, those weren't empty. Smith and his followers, they faced constant persecution, violence because of their stance on race.
Yeah. It's easy to forget that, looking back.
It makes you understand just how risky those actions were. Did he have any, practical ideas about how to actually achieve abolition?
He did. He proposed a gradual emancipation plan that included compensating slave owners with funds from the sale of public lands.
Oh, interesting.
He also advocated for reducing congressional salaries to free up even more money for this purpose.
So he wasn't just calling for an end to slavery. He was thinking about, the complexities of the situation.
Yeah.
And proposing concrete solutions.
Exactly.
He recognized the economic anxieties of slave owners while also advocating for a morally just outcome.
Exactly. He understood that change wouldn't happen overnight.
Right.
It required careful planning and willingness to compromise, even while holding fast to his core principles.
This is where he really starts to stand out as a visionary leader, isn't it?
Absolutely.
He's not just reacting to events. He's putting forth a bold vision for a more just and equitable future.
Absolutely. And his vision extended beyond just ending slavery.
Okay.
He called for a true sense of universal brotherhood.
Right.
Arguing that all people, regardless of race, were created equal in the eyes of God.
It's amazing to think that these ideas were being espoused in the midst of such a racially charged and divided nation. Do we have any examples of his actual words from that campaign?
We do. There's a powerful passage from his platform
Okay.
that really captures his passion and urgency. It reads, "The wisdom which ought to characterize the freest, wisest, and most noble nation of the 19th century should, like the sun in his meridian splendor, warm every object beneath its rays, and the main efforts of her officers, who are nothing more or less than the servants of the people, ought to be directed to make life better for everyone, black or white bond, or free for the best of books, says God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. Petition also, ye goodly inhabitants of the slave states, your legislators, to abolish slavery by the year 1850 or now, and save the abolitionists from reproach and ruin, infamy and shame. Pray Congress to pay every man a reasonable price for his slaves out of the surplus revenue arising from the sale of public lands and from the deduction of pay from the members of Congress. Break off the shackles from the poor black man and hire him to labor like other human beings, for an hour of virtuous liberty on earth is worth a whole eternity of bondage."
Wow. You can really hear the conviction in his voice, the absolute belief in the inherent worth of all people. It's such a stark contrast to the prevailing attitudes of the time. Yeah, it was revolutionary.
And you have to remember the context.
Right.
Putting forth such a radical vision in that political climate was incredibly risky.
Yeah, he knew the stakes.
He knew he was putting his life on the line for what he believed in.
It's a huge moment in American history, and a tragic one, because just a few months after he announces he's running, Joseph Smith was killed.
Assassinated, yeah. Shot by a mob. While he was imprisoned in Illinois.
He was only 38 years old.
Way too young. And it really makes you wonder, what if? What if he'd lived? What if he'd gotten the chance to make those ideas about equality central to American politics? It's a question that, I don't know, it sticks with you.
It really does. His assassination, it silenced a voice that was calling for change, and it left behind, well, a mixed legacy. Inspiring, but also things were left undone. It's full of contradictions, complexities,
He was a man of his time, right? Shaped by the prejudices, but he could see past them too. He could challenge the very foundation of those prejudices. And I think it reminds us that history, those figures we study, it's rarely simple, black and white.
It's easy to want to put people in boxes, but Joseph Smith, he doesn't fit neatly.
He really doesn't. I mean, he suffered horrific violence, racially motivated, obviously, but then he champions racial equality in ways few others did back then. He leads this religious movement, and yeah, sometimes it reflected the prejudices of the time. But he also pushes boundaries, challenges those prejudices head on.
It makes you think about progress and how it happens. It's rarely a straight line, is it?
Never is.
And that's what makes his story so fascinating, so relevant, even now, almost 200 years later. Because it makes us question what we think we know about the past, about these uncomfortable truths.
And it asks us to think about the legacy of those who came before. To see their flaws, yeah, but also to, to honor their courage when they showed it.
It challenges us to do the same, doesn't it? Have the courage of our convictions, fight for what we believe in, even when it's hard, even when it's unpopular. To be willing to stand up and say, this isn't right, and to work towards something better.
Smith's story, to me, it's a reminder that change is possible. That's something worth remembering.
It really is. And that's why we do this, why we dive into these stories, these fascinating, sometimes overlooked parts of history, because often the stories we least expect, those are the ones that teach us the most about ourselves, about where we came from, about the potential we have to build a better future. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation, to say the least. I know I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time.
Me too. It's always a pleasure to explore these topics with you and really dig into these texts.
And a huge thank you to you, the listener, for bringing this to our attention.
Oh.
We are so grateful for your thoughtful questions and for the chance to dive deep into this fascinating topic with you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those deeper layers of meaning in everything you do.